Hi everybody, welcome to your virus and disease set of video notes. So we're going to first talk a little bit about some general characteristics of viruses. So viruses, first you need to know that they are not living. Viruses are not alive. However, they have some characteristics that other living things do have, such as the ability to evolve and adapt, which is why you get a flu shot every year, and you can still get the flu every year because that virus is constantly evolving. And then they also have some sort of genetic material, usually in the form of DNA, but there are quite a few viruses that have RNA. But like we said, they are not alive. So there's three major reasons viruses are not alive. That's they don't have organelles, they can't make proteins, and they can't reproduce on their own. They require a host to reproduce. So when we talk about viruses in general, there's some major structures that you should be aware of. And you're probably going to want to pause the video here and either sketch these in your notes or fill out the organizer for these four shapes. So we have a helical structure, we have a polyhedral structure, a spherical structure, and the complex structure. And the complex structure is called a bacteriophage. The spherical is typically like what your influenza looks like. And then helical and polyhedral are a little less common. We're mostly going to talk about spherical and complex structured viruses. It's also important to note that they have that genetic core, so either that DNA or RNA, and then they have something called a capsid, which is a protein coat. And if you remember back to bacteria, bacteria have a capsule. So it's really, really important that you keep those two separated. They're very easily confused for students in this unit. So we've talked about the shapes. Now let's talk about the types. Viruses can infect all different parts of your body. They can infect your skin, your blood, your respiratory system, sexually transmitted viruses, or other organs. And to the left here, you'll see some pictures of just a few of the common ones, things like HIV, hepatitis B, Ebola. We talked about that bacteriophage, influenza, and adenovirus. And you'll see the list of just common viruses. I'm sure at some point all of you have either had a common cold or the influenza. You probably had a chickenpox vaccine. And then hepatitis, Ebola, HIV, herpes are all also very common viruses. So viral infection in general, like we said, viruses are not considered living because they require a host to reproduce. So they rely on that host to inject their genetic material, and then the host cell makes more viruses for them. So the virus has to attach to a specific site to infect, and if you notice in this little clip up here, you'll see that happening. It's about to cycle back in a second. So you'll see the different parts of the virus, which is the blue thing, attaching to those green receptors, and that's where it goes into the cell to infect. Most viruses, important to note, are species specific. So for example, if you're sick, you're not going to get your dog sick, okay? Vice versa. So most of the time, some of the really bad viruses have been known to jump species, which is pretty scary for scientists, but for the most part, they're species specific. Within that then, viruses have one of two life cycles. So they either have a lytic life cycle or a lysogenic life cycle, and we're going to get into those here. So lytic cycle, first of all, once again, they're very similar words. They're very easy to confuse. The easiest way to keep these two straight is lytic is a shorter word than lysogenic, and it's also a shorter cycle. So in the lytic cycle, the viral genes are going to replicate separate. Huge thing to remember. Separate from the host cell DNA. Yes, they still take over the host cell nucleus and they trick it into making more of their viral DNA or RNA, but they don't inject their DNA into the host DNA. Then, once all these viruses are created, eventually the cell gets too large and the cell is going to burst. This is why if you ever have a viral infection with a sore throat, your throat hurts because those cells are bursting. So that in turn releases more and more viruses, and then the cycle continues. So examples here are things like common cold or influenza. And you can see this diagram over here shows a really great way of how this happens. So you see the bacteriophage there is going, it's injecting its genetic material. You see that genetic material is multiplied here, then it's assembled, and then here's the bursting of the cell. So within this cycle, there's an advantage and a disadvantage that you need to be aware of. So the advantage is this is a fast cycle. Typically, if you come in contact with someone that has a cold or a flu, you're probably going to have symptoms, if you're going to get sick from it, within a couple days. And it takes over your host cells quickly. The disadvantage, though, however, is the host cell is killed. So that viral info isn't necessarily passed down to new cells. They make more and they release them into the environment of the body, but the host cell is killed, so the viruses have to find a new host. That's where lysogenic comes in. So lysogenic, longer word, longer cycle. This time, the DNA or the RNA of the virus injects itself into the host cell DNA or RNA. So if you look here, you'll see that in this box there, that little red strip is the viral DNA, and it's permanently a part of the host cell DNA. So that cell is going to continue normal functions, mitosis, making more of itself, and it's always going to pass down that DNA. Well, that's a problem because it never goes away. So once you get one of these viruses, you will never get rid of it. So HIV and herpes are two really common examples. Now, people with these diseases don't always present the symptoms. Sometimes they're in kind of like a remission where they're not having an outbreak. That means that their cells are over in this section here. Occasionally, one of those cells will kind of flip and go into the lytic cycle to release more viruses to go infect other cells and permanently integrate their DNA. So when they have outbreaks, so someone with HIV or herpes, they tend to get sores that you can visibly see. That would be those cells going into the lytic cycle. So as with the lytic, lysogenic also has an advantage and a disadvantage. So the advantage is almost the opposite of the lytic cycle in that the viral info is passed on, so many more viruses are made long term. The disadvantage, however, comes in because the replication takes longer. That virus doesn't take over the cell's nucleus to make a bunch of its own. It has to wait for the cell to divide, and sometimes cells divide slowly. So now let's talk about treatment. Vaccines are super important to treatment or prevention more so of viruses. So the biggest thing that always comes up is, should you take antibiotics when you get sick with a virus? And the answer is no. That's just going to make it worse. It's going to make antibiotic resistance worse because antibiotics won't do anything for a virus. You can sometimes get antiviral drugs, and this helps reduce the symptoms and maybe the length of your infection, but it doesn't actually get rid of the virus. Your body has to do that naturally on its own with the immune system. So that's where vaccines come in. So vaccines are essentially a dead or weakened version of the virus that's injected into your body, and it helps stimulate antibody production. So the antibodies that are produced are these little cells that go around and target when this virus comes back in again. So they're kind of like a memory cell. So from the vaccine, sometimes you may have like very mild symptoms or none at all, but a lot of times it's nothing. But when you are exposed to that flu or whatever you got your vaccine for, you won't have symptoms because those antibodies are already going to be ready to go and attack the invader. So it's also important to note there's a lot of research out there, and there's a lot of kind of false media attention on vaccines. And one person, one time, published this article about vaccines being linked to autism, and then everyone else just kind of ran with it. But there is actually no scientific proof that vaccines do cause autism. So now we've talked about viruses. We previously talked about bacteria that make you sick. There's two other things you should know about, and they're both more so considered infectious particles. So it's a viroid and a prion. So a viroid is an infectious particle that's kind of like a virus, not quite, but it causes disease in plants, so plants only, and it stunts the growth of plants, or it can cause kind of some issues with appearance-wise, like you'll see in this apple over here. They do have a single RNA strand, but they don't have that protein coat, so they don't have that capsid to protect them. And this is typically passed on through seeds or the pollen of the plant. And a common example over here is apple scar skin viroid. And honestly, it doesn't really make it look that bad. It still looks like an apple, but if you have a choice between that apple and a nice red apple in the grocery store, you're probably going to pick the red one, right? So it's a problem for production and farmers and agriculture. The other thing you should know about then is a prion. So this is an infectious material made of proteins. So proteins don't have genetic material. So this becomes a problem because your immune system doesn't react to proteins. So once you have a disease like this, once you have symptoms, they may appear gradually, but then once they're full force, it's always fatal because the body doesn't have a response. The immune system isn't going to attack it because it's a protein. And a good example here is mad cow disease. So in the US, USDA, we have a lot of regulations on meat. So you're very, very, very unlikely to be exposed to this in the US. However, if you're ever traveling abroad, be very careful with beef that you're eating because it could potentially have mad cow disease because they don't regulate it as much. And if you look up here in this picture, you'll see the difference. The left side is with mad cow and the right side is normal. So that's just a difference in the brain. All right, so we've talked about all these different things that cause disease. So let's talk a little bit more about disease in general. So first I want to give you just a really quick little mini lesson on the immune system. Maybe it's a refresher, maybe it's new to you, but there's two specific words you need to know here, and that's antigens and antibodies. So antigens are the bad guys. They're the ones that invade your body, that make you sick. And then antibodies are the good guys. They're the ones that respond to them. You have antibodies in your body ready to attack antigens. And they are tailored to specific antigens. So what that means is you have immunity. So you're born with natural immunity from your mom. You had the umbilical cord, you had her blood, breast milk. All of those things give you immunity to some diseases. You're getting some of her antibodies. You also acquire immunity over time in the form of vaccines, or if you're sick, you have immunity to that illness and you won't get that illness again. You also have these really cool things called memory cells, and they recognize repeat invaders and they attack them right away. So often you don't even have symptoms. So this is why you get a flu shot, because you're creating those memory cells, or why you don't have the chicken pox, or even why your dog might get a rabies shot. But then the question becomes, why do you still get the flu shot every year? And we talked about this briefly, and it's because the flu mutates, it evolves and adapts, so we have to evolve our vaccines to go with it. So there's types of disease. There's 4 major ones. We've talked about bacterial, we've talked about viral, and there's 2 we haven't discussed, and those are parasitic and hereditary. So parasitic, just what you think, caused by a parasite. Sometimes it's intentional to humans, sometimes accidental. Things like tapeworms, malaria comes from mosquitoes, Lyme disease is from ticks. And then you also have hereditary diseases, which we've already kind of discussed in genetics a little bit. So you get these diseases from your parents. There is gene therapy out there that's becoming more and more prevalent to help, but some popular things like sickle cell anemia, muscular dystrophy, or hemophilia. So 2 other things then we need to talk about are allergies. So allergies are kind of a disease, but it's essentially your body's overreaction to a harmless antigen. So pollen isn't a bad antigen, plants need it, but sometimes your body overreacts to it. So then something called histamine causes all those blood vessels to be all leaky, which is why you run your nose, your eyes water, you sneeze. So then the question is, what do we take for allergies? Antihistamine. So histamine is what your body is releasing, so you take an antihistamine to kind of counteract that. And then lastly, autoimmune disorders. So an autoimmune, auto self. So it's when your antibodies, the good guys that are in your body, are actually tricked into attacking your body's healthy cells. So things like type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, celiac, multiple sclerosis are all considered autoimmune disorders. And to go a step further with that, HIV becomes an autoimmune disease after that initial viral infection. So you're infected with the virus, and then it tricks your antibodies into attacking your own helper T cells, which you need, and then HIV becomes full-blown AIDS once your helper T cell count falls below that 200 level. All right, and that's all for your notes.